Right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the, I guess, what is the quarterly conversation, quarterly learning experience having to do with, I guess, trailblazers in the field of psychedelic research for all kinds of reasons, but especially for therapeutics. My name is Jarrett Burton. I am the coordinator of the DuPage Recovery Oriented System of Care program, which is one of the groups that helps put on these events. And we are here, as always, in beautiful Urban Apothecary in Batavia, Illinois. Get a round of applause for Urban Apothecary, everybody, for hosting us. And our great friend Cheryl, who helps us put these on, is such a great hostess, and more than just a hostess, great friend to us and these topics in the program. A couple of things, housekeeping purposes to start. Number one, please make sure on the Zoom side that you're muted unless it's time for questions, which we'll try to leave obviously some time for at the end, but that helps cut down on interruptions. And the second major rule, every bit as important, remember in these conversations, in these sessions, there is no sourcing of any kind, both in questions or in the chat. So that's just something we try to avoid. So we get that out of the way early so we don't have to address it later. So having said all that, I'm now going to turn to my friend Bruce Seawick to give an intro for our fabulous guest tonight.
So I'm very excited to have Dr. Dennis McKenna here. Myself, along with my colleague John Neal in the back there, are part of the Chicago Consciousness Cafe, and his wife, who's on Zoom. We hosted many psychedelic movies in Chicago, and Dennis actually spoke at one of our gatherings when we were live before COVID. So it's an honor to have you here. I appreciate that. A little bit about Dennis. Dennis McKenna's research has focused on the interdisciplinary study of Amazonian ethnopharmacology. He has conducted extensive ethnobotanical fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon. His doctoral research at the University of British Columbia in 1984 focused on the ethnopharmacology of ayahuasca and okihi, two tryptamine-based hallucinogens used by indigenous people in the Northwest Amazon. He is a founding board member of the Hefter Research Institute and was a key organizer and participant in the Huasca Project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. He is the younger brother of Terence McKenna, and from 2000 to 2017, he taught courses on ethnopharmacology, botanical medicines, and plants and human affairs in the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. In collaboration with his colleagues, he organized two landmark conferences in both 2017 and 2022, the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs. In 2019, in collaboration with colleagues, he incorporated a new nonprofit, the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. He emigrated to Canada in the spring of 2019, together with his wife Sheila, and now resides in Abbotsford, British Columbia. So without any further ado, and a great honor to present Dr. Dennis McKenna. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Bruce and Jamie and Jarrett, and the organizers of this event. I am honored and pleased to be back. Yes, I think you got the date right. The last time I was in Chicago was before COVID, so it's been a while. Okay, so we'll get started on this. So this is about psilocybin and the origins of consciousness, obviously, an examination of the stone date hypothesis, as it's been called. The chemistry of psilocybin and psilocin and then magic mushrooms, as everyone here knows already. The active principles are tryptamines. They're simple tryptamines, psilocin, and it's phosphate ester psilocybin. Psilocybin is actually a prodrug. It's converted to psilocin in the body, and that's the active form. That's what actually binds to the serotonin receptors. And they were first isolated from the Mexican mushroom samples by Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD in 1958 and subsequently synthesized these compounds. Psilocybin is widespread in the mushroom families, the agaricales. It's found in the genus Psilocybe primarily, but also Paniolus, Copelandia, Gymnopolis, and so forth. There are over 230 psilocybian species of magic mushrooms. They're distributed worldwide. I use the word psilocybian to denote mushrooms that contain psilocybin, though they're not necessarily psilocybe species. As you can see in the next slide, they're all over the place. They occur in various families, and the psilocybe is by far the most abundant in terms of the number of psilocybian species. But Paniolus and Copelandia are runners up. They have 13 and 12 species. So these complex molecules are pretty widespread in the mushroom families, in the mushroom orders, I should say, different families of mushrooms. We can think about the phylogeny of fungi. When did psilocybin first show up in fungal evolution? Well, we actually have a pretty good idea. Fungi are among the oldest living organisms. There's fossil evidence of filamentous fungi found in volcanic lava layers dated to 2.4 billion years in South Africa. So that's pretty far back. And the find may be the earliest evidence of the eukaryotes, the phylogenetic branch that contains fungi, animals, and plants. The phylogenetic branch that involves nucleated nuclei, cellular nuclei, which is why they're called the eukaryotes. And mushrooms belong to the basidiomycetes, which are the gilled mushrooms. So the oldest known mushroom fossils were found in sedimentary limestone formations known as the Crato Formation in the Araripe Basin in northeastern Brazil. The specimen, it's a mouthful, named Gondwana agaricites magnificus, were dated to 115 million years ago, before the supercontinent Gondwana split into the South American and African land masses that we know today. So here's some visual depictions of this. This 2.4 billion year filamentous fungal fossil from the Ongeluk Formation of Northern Cape, South Africa. And then below is this fossil mushroom. And mushrooms are soft tissue, right? So they don't last very long. They don't make good fossils. So it's very rare to find fossilized mushrooms, but this one has been found, and this has been dated to about 115 million years ago. It was preserved in limestone, and this was done by researchers at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, which is, I believe, close to you. So that's a remarkable find. There are not a lot of fungal mushrooms, fossil mushrooms, scattered around in the fossil record. There is, however, a couple of other remarkable ones. Occasionally, mushrooms became encased in amber, and in that case, the specimens were perfectly preserved. These are not psilocybian mushrooms. These are actually in the genus Mycena, probably. But you can see the living mushrooms there on the lower right, and the preserved specimens. Well, these are young comparatively. These are only about 110 million years old. So still large spans of time. Well, how did psilocybin become so widespread in the agaricales, in the gilled mushrooms? It turns out that it happened through a process called horizontal gene transfer, which involves gene exchanges between non-related organisms. This is fairly common among bacteria, and contributes small fragments of genetic information, leaving the traditional tree of life intact. So it's a horizontal transfer. It skips the usual branching path to these things. And researchers at the Ohio State University determined that what you call the psilocybin gene cluster, a set of 5 enzymes associated with psilocybin biosynthesis, have been transferred by this process of horizontal gene transfer. Psilocybin now occurs in over 200 species of mushrooms, not really that closely related. And psilocybin horizontal gene transfer involves the transmission of gene complexes that do not involve parental transmission, but occur instead by viral transmission or acquisition through soil vectors. The process is common in bacteria in the acquisition of antibiotic resistance, but is quite rare in fungi. Yes, so the conclusion is that psilocybin must be important in some way. And indeed, horizontal gene transfer is thought to be a response to environmental stressors. So the researchers that reported this said, we report the discovery of a psilocybin gene cluster in 3 hallucinogenic mushroom genomes and evidence for its horizontal transfer between fungal lineages. Patterns of gene distribution and transmission suggest that synthesis of psilocybin may have provided a fitness advantage in the dung and late wood decay fungal niches, which may serve as reservoirs of fungal indole-based metabolites that alter behavior of mycophagus, that is, fungi eating, and wood eating invertebrates. These hallucinogenic mushroom genomes may serve as models in neurochemical ecology, advancing the bioprospecting and synthetic biology of novel neuropharmaceuticals, or so these researchers say. What makes psilocybin so unusual? What is the use of this compound, basically, for the fungi that make it? Well, new research in the journal Evolution Letters has uncovered evidence that its functional purpose is there to screw with insects, basically. Plausible enough. Specifically, those insects that wouldn't mind chowing down on a mushroom or on the food that fungi themselves like to eat. In other words, psilocybin involved in mushrooms to drive insects crazy. And basically, fungi, the mushrooms, compete with insects for the same substrate. They all grow on wood or dung. That's the same food source that insects also utilize. So by producing psilocybin, they effectively, it acts as a repellent to the insect, or it's been speculated more likely that it's basically the insects become confused and they forget where the food sources are. I don't know how they determined that. I haven't asked the insects, but that's one speculation. But here's another example of psilocybin. I guess the point that I'm trying to make here is that fungi are basically made out of filaments. They're made out of hypha. They don't have any hands. They don't have any external appendages. They can't manipulate their world very effectively, but they're very effective. They've evolved to modify behavior. And that's what they do. They're very clever. They form symbiotic relationships with other species. They modify their behavior and turn these other species, which they essentially symbiose with or parasitize, into willing zombies to carry out their program. So here's one example: cicadas and Mesospora, which is a type of fungus that makes psilocybin. It's not a basidiomycete, but it still does make psilocybin, and it's what's called an entomopathogenic fungi. It is a fungus that infects insects, and they routinely kill their hosts before releasing infectious spores, but a few species keep insects alive while sporulating, which enhances spore dispersal. And that's what's happening here. The mechanisms underlying this active spore transmission is elusive. And here, the authors report the discovery through metabolomics of the plant-associated amphetamine, cathedone, in 4 Mesospora cicadina-affected periodical cicada populations that also co-occurs with psilocybin in these annual cicadas associated with Mesospora species. The neurogenic activities of these compounds suggest the extended phenotype of Mesospora that modifies cicada behavior to maximize dissemination is chemically induced. That's if fungi have an agenda, it's to spread their spores, it's to disperse their spores. And this is a very clever mechanism. By enslaving these cicadas, it accomplishes that objective. So here is a diagram of how this takes place. The acacias, the cicadas spend many years underground, up to 17 years, and then they molt and they emerge from the ground. When the infected cicada emerges, its abdomen is already infected with the mycelium, and it begins to form spores in place of where its abdomen is. Now, the infected cicadas do not overwinter, but when the other acacias emerge from the ground, they're there, and they are hopped up effectively on the cathedone, which is an amphetamine-like stimulant. So they're hopped up on cathedone, and the infected cicadas attempt to mate indiscriminately with anything that comes near them, including other acacias. So basically, through this process, it distributes their spores, and this is what it looks like. So these sex-crazed zombie cicadas, when they emerge from their pupation, the abdomen looks like this. It's just a mass of spores, and then they frenetically wiggle their rear ends around, and the spores fly and infect other cicadas. So probably somebody has tried these psilocybin-infected cicadas, but I haven't read any reports, and I don't really recommend it because, for one thing, there's no telling what else is in the cicada that might not be so good. So, continuing this theme about fungal behavior modification, another classic example that everyone knows about or may know about is cordyceps. It's not a mushroom. It's in the Ascomycetes. There's about 400 species of cordyceps, and these are endoparasitic on insects and other arthropods. They transform their hosts into zombies by infecting the host tissues and taking over their brains. They influence the insect's behavior to optimize spore dispersal. Cordyceps militaris is one of the most commonly known cordyceps species. It's called the caterpillar fungus, and it's an important and popular Chinese medicine. Very expensive. Cordyceps also was featured in the HBO series The Last of Us, which came out in 2023, about cannibal zombies created by infection of humans by a mutant strain of cordyceps. Not to worry, though. We don't think this could happen, but you never know. So here is the mechanism in one species of how cordyceps works. So the insect is foraging on the this is a carpenter ant. The insect forages on the forest floor, and spores are falling from the canopy, and then it gets infected. The mycelium invades the insect, but it does not does not kill it. It invades its brain and it induces it to climb up to a leaf or the end of a stalk of grass or some position that is optimal for spore dispersal. Then the Haustoria infecting the brain will cause the insect to have a death grip, to grab onto whatever it's holding onto, and then it kills it. And then the fungus continues to grow throughout the body of the insect and eventually produces or sporangia, something called a stroma. And this structure here is full of spores. And then the spores burst from that. And the insect is on the leaf above the canopy, and the spores begin to fall to the ground and create a killing zone. And all the unsuspecting ants below are infected by the rain of spores coming from above. So that's the way that cordyceps does what it does. And there are many kinds of cordyceps, and they infect all kinds of things, not just insects, but also spiders and other arthropods. And then this one from The Last of Us, this fictional TV series is on the right there. That was their idea of what somebody infected with cordyceps might look like. And, I don't know if any of you have seen this series, but it's kind of interesting. Actually, I haven't seen it. I've seen clips from it, but it sort of depicts fungi in a fairly sinister light. And if you're being the one infected, I suppose you would look at it that way. But this is just biology, folks. This is how they survive. This is how they propagate their spores. So it seems strange to us, but it's not. It's just this. This is how nature works. And so we've talked about different examples of fungi that modify behavior. And behavior modification seems to be a thing that mushrooms and other fungi are able to do. So maybe psilocybin could be thought of as an eco-neural hormone. The net effect of this zombification is to enlist these organisms as an unwilling partner in the fungi's agenda, which is basically to optimize spore dispersal. The bizarre example of cicada-Massospora relationships also demonstrates that psilocybin can also function as an eco-neural hormone that turns the cicadas into sex-crazed spore dispersers. Could the interactions of psilocybin-containing mushrooms with humans be regarded as a similar eco-neural hormonal symbiotic relationship? In this case, the fungi do not invade the brain directly. Instead, the eco-neural hormone psilocybin facilitates a symbiotic relationship. Humans partner with the fungus to facilitate spore dispersal. Humans benefit from the effects on consciousness and perception, which we enjoy most of the time. And with biotechnology, we have even facilitated horizontal gene transfer by harvesting the genes for psilocybin synthesis out of mushrooms and transferring them into other organisms, such as yeast or bacteria, that this would never show up in the natural course of evolution. So this is clearly a human artifact, but the genes for psilocybin synthesis, which might be called the psilocybin synthetase complex, has been transferred to fungi, to yeast, to other fungi such as yeast and also bacteria. And I believe there's even work on transferring it into tobacco and other higher plants. Why this needs to be done, I'm not sure. This is a classic case of we do it because we can do it. I have reservations about this. This is one of those sort of two-edged technology that we need to think carefully about how we deploy it. Mushrooms, psilocybin mushrooms, are quite capable of synthesizing psilocybin on their own, and they can be cultivated at any scale. So do we really need to put it in tobacco or yeast? There may be reasons for doing so, but that's another conversation. Here's another example of behavior modification, I guess you could say. When we went to the Amazon, my brother and I, back in 1971, you can read all about that misadventure in my book or other places. But one thing that we did do, I mean, it was quite a misadventure in some ways, but one of the things that we did that we brought back from that trip was spores of the mushrooms. And that's the only thing that really has had a lasting impact. We messed around with it. Any 11th grade science nerd could figure it out with a little patience. And we published a little pamphlet, basically a very small book, the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. And that made psilocybin and psilocybin mushrooms available to a wide number of people. Many people bought the book, and many people gave it a try, and they were able to do it. So it's a very simple technique. I mean, there are better techniques now. This was written, actually, this year is the 50th anniversary of the publication of the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Grower's Guide. And once you have that, then you have access to the experiences. They open up the vision screens to unknown dimensions, beautiful, dangerous, and alien dimensions. Terence McKenna once famously said, "We are involved in a symbiotic relationship with something that has disguised itself as an alien invasion so as not to alarm us." I think I disagree with Terence on a number of points. For one thing, psilocybin mushrooms are not extraterrestrial. It's an interesting myth. It's it was the foreword to this book that he wrote, but they are definitely not extraterrestrial. They are not alien, but the experiences they induce might seem very alien. We completely understand where psilocybin-containing species fit into the phylogeny of earthly life. Their chemistry, genetics, and lineage are all well understood and firmly established. Psilocybin-containing species do not invade us and turn us into zombies. Instead, they offer symbiotic partnership with our species, which we readily accept. Both the fungal species and our species benefit from this relationship. With our help, the fungi fulfill their agenda, if you could call it that, which is to spread and to grow. And in turn, the fungi offer us this beautiful gift, psilocybin, which makes us better, more conscious humans. And again, in Terence's words, opens the vision screens to many worlds, not necessarily to extraterrestrial worlds. So we can talk about the emergence of consciousness in evolution and phylogeny. And there are a few milestones that are worth noting in this process. The first would be arousal, motility, the ability of organisms basically to detect and respond to environmental stimuli in a very primitive fashion. That's evidence of sentience. They have to be able to sense an environmental stimulus in order to respond to it. And that's dated to the early Cambrian age, about 540 million years ago. And then around 315 million years ago, there was a divergence of the phylogenetic ancestors of birds, reptiles, and mammals. Phylogenetically conserved distinct structures such as brainstems, diencephalic structures such as the thalamus and the hypothalamus and association cortex emerged in organisms around this time. And that enabled recurrent or feedback processing. These structures are the neural core for primitive consciousness in vertebrates, including, of course, humans. Consciousness of the self occurred much later, only around 5 million years ago. It is thought what is called mere self recognition in primates. Primate be able to look in a mirror and realize that they are looking at themselves. And that subjective self awareness is kind of a marker which marked the divergence between monkeys and the great apes. And then over the next 4 to 2 million years ago, really to about 100,000 years ago, there was a rapid expansion of the neocortex, of neocortical structures. And that is reflected on the experimental level with a rich subjective inner experience, effectively an oniric state, a state of dreaming. Advanced that included symbolic processing, reflection and projection in time, anterior to posterior reference in space, and enhanced neocortical connectivity. So there was a lot going on in that period. And this is an interesting graphic, which I ripped off shamelessly from Wikipedia. I thought it was quite good. But this shows the phylogenetic spiral of life going way back to the earliest instance of life around, around 4.1 billion years ago. So a lot was going on in the evolution of life. But then in the Pleistocene, stop doing that. In the Pleistocene, around 500 million years ago, the Pleistocene and the Holocene, things began to get very interesting in terms of the differentiation of consciousness. So another way to look at this also is in terms of deep time. On the left there, the scale is in billions of years. 1,000 is 1 billion year. And certain stages in evolution were significant. Of course, the emergence of simple life between 4 and 3,500, 3.5 billion years ago, the appearance of photosynthesis in the environment, the appearance of photosynthetic organisms that could harvest light and produce complex organic compounds and secrete oxygen into the atmosphere, which was a major, oxygen was a corrosive gas when it first appeared in evolution. And in response, eukaryotes had to develop protection against this. And many single-celled organisms clumped together and took refuge in other organisms. And that was the appearance of the eukaryotes. Basically, that was a response to oxygen poisoning. And the anaerobes, the non-aerobic organisms, kind of receded and retreated deep into the earth at that point, where they still are. And then complex multicellular life showed up around 1.5 billion years ago. And then at the very top of this chart, things got compressed. The dinosaurs, the mammals, the flowers appeared all in the last 500 million years. So the earliest humans showed up basically in the last few minutes. If this was a 24-hour period, humans would be about the last 30 seconds of this chart. So it led to this rapid expansion of our neurocortical structures. The human species is an anomaly in the order of nature. We're the only species with a complex language. We're the only technology using species. We're the only species able to store information outside of ourselves and transmit it non-genetically to future generations. We're the only species for whom symbols, ideas, and abstractions are as real as the physical world. This preoccupation with abstract symbols is the foundation of human structure, human culture. And it is culture, the edifice composed of art, science, religion, magic, myth, medicine, technology, folklore, law, etc., that sets us apart from other biological species. It is also clear that much of human culture, especially language, would not exist were it not for our extraordinarily complex brain. And this is a rough timeline of human neural evolution. This is obviously constantly being revived here, but the take home lesson is that starting around 2 million years ago, the emergence of Homo habilis, the first true hominid, happened about 2 million years ago. And between Homo habilis and Homo sapiens, which is shown in this diagram as the pinnacle species, although maybe it isn't, but that's how it's. But the take-home lesson is that there was an enormous and almost explosive expansion of the human neural cortex. Cortical volume is shown on the right scale here, so that Homo habilis had about 500 cubic centimeters cortical volume. Homo sapiens, Homo erectus was about roughly, anyway, Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. So Homo sapiens has 3 times the cortical volume of Homo habilis. There was an enormous, rapid increase in size, not only size, but also in complexification of the human brain. The question perpetually is, what could have triggered this? How did this happen? Well, in my brother's paradigm-shattering 1993 book, Food of the Gods, Terence speculated that a symbiotic relationship between psilocybin mushrooms and evolving hominid populations on the savannas of northern Africa at the dawn of prehistory was the catalytic trigger that marked the emergence of consciousness and the consequences of that event, namely the development of language, cognition, visual arts, performing arts, shamanism, and the earliest intimations of the divine followed that process. This is a picture of an early hominid from Alex Gray showing vocalization of the visualized language that psilocybin makes possible through the experience of synesthesia. Were it not for language, there would be no human culture. Culture is made of language, and complex language depends on the relationship between abstractions, ideas, and signification. Comprehension results from the discovery of meaningful relationships between word, image, and symbols. This is the basis of cognition. Human consciousness and cognition is characterized by language. Language is the ability to associate meaningless sounds with meaningful images and symbols. Much of human neural architecture is dedicated to this ability to associate sounds, images, and symbols. It's the ability to derive meaning from sounds, images, and symbols. Effectively, this is a process of synesthesia, the translation of one sensory modality into another. This is a painting of synesthesia by the Pablo Amaringo, who was a Peruvian artist who depicted his ayahuasca visions and published a book under the title Ayahuasca Visions. Synesthesia is very common in ayahuasca states and also in psilocybin states. Psychedelics facilitate synesthesia. Synesthetic experiences reinforce the linkage between oral input and abstract symbols, image enation in the real sense. For archaic humans, psychedelics function as neurocognitive programming tools. They were the software that activated our neural hardware and enabled it to create the hallucination in which we're all immersed, a consensual reality in which symbols, ideas, abstractions expressed through language are as real as the external world and, in fact, imbue it with meaning and significance. To generate what I like to call the reality hallucination. In other words, our ordinary state of conscious awareness is actually a model of reality that our brains construct. It integrates the input filtered through the sensory neural interface, combines that with the interpretive and associative functions of inner experience, and effectively we construct a model reality, effectively a hallucination that we then proceed to live in. Both the input from the real world and the output, our interactions and responses to whatever is out there, are filtered through this sensory neural interface. So the reality hallucination is what we experience of reality. It's not reality itself, it's a model of reality. Reality itself, which we presume is out there somewhere, is unknowable, except that we now have instruments through physics and other things that can probe this external reality. And what it tells us is that what we think reality looks like is really nothing like what it really looks like. So we construct this reality hallucination. And of course, Lily Tomlin observed that reality is a crutch for people who can't cope with drugs. One basic dimension of behavior compellingly revealed in LSD states and other psychedelic states is portentousness, the capacity of the mind to see more than it can tell, to experience more than it can explicate, to believe in and be impressed with more than it can rationally justify, to experience boundlessness and boundaryless events from the banal to the profound. And anyone who's had a psychedelic experience is probably familiar with this sense that the world experience is imbued with deep meaning and significance. In other words, portentousness. One of the cultural artifacts that emerged from these psychedelics encounters was religion. Religion is a set of beliefs and practices, often centered on specific supernatural and moral claims about reality, the cosmos, and human nature, and often codified as prayer, ritual, and religious law. Religion also encompasses ancestral or cultural traditions, writings, history, and mythology, as well as personal faith and mystic experience. The term religion refers to both the personal practices related to communal faith and to group rituals and communication stemming from shared conviction. Psychedelics are not in themselves a religion. What they do is activate religious sensibilities. Another technology, you may say, or human institution that emerged from psychedelic experiences is shamanism. Shamanism refers to a range of traditional beliefs and practices concerned with communication with the spirit world. Practitioners of shamanism are known as shamans. There are many variations of shamanism throughout the world, though there are some beliefs that are shared by all forms of shamanism. The idea that spirits play important roles in human lives, that the shaman can control or cooperate with the spirits for the community's benefit, that spirits can be either good or bad. Shamans engage in various processes and techniques to incite trance, such as singing, dancing, taking psychedelics, meditating, and drumming. In other words, deliberate alterations of consciousness. Animals play an important role in shamanism, acting as omens and message bearers, as well as representation of animal spirit guides. the shaman's spirit leaves the body and enters into the supernatural world during certain tasks. In fact, soul retrieval is one of the main functions of shamanism. Is often understood, illnesses are often understood to originate through the loss of the soul. The shaman can enter these other dimensions, can treat illnesses or sicknesses by retrieving the soul. So shamanism is basically a healing technique. Shamans are healers. Here's one example of shamanism. The Safali mushroom shaman, this iconography in this rock painting from northern Algeria. This is dated to 4 to 8,000 BC and depicts a bee-like a shamanic figure with a bee mask, and apparently his body has mushrooms growing in it, appearing in it. And this over here shows these strange mushroom-headed figures sort of ecstatically running along, and they're waving mushrooms, and they're clearly having a good time. It's been speculated that these structures here, these round structures, may represent hallucinations. But shamanism is very ancient. I mean, this is old. 8,000 BC is pretty old. Shamanism predates this, probably by hundreds of thousands of years, if not millions of years. Shamanism is basically a technique for dealing with these altered states that psychedelics render available. Maria Sabina is the classic Mazatec mushroom shaman. The woman that was the informant for R. Gordon Wasson when he went looking for magic mushrooms in Oaxaca in the 50s. Probably to her regret, she became very famous, but maybe more famous than she wanted to be. But the shaman is as much a poet as a healer. Someone who, through language, songs, and stories, expresses the cosmic and mythical narratives of their culture as received in the shamanic trance. There's a wonderful passage in a book called Hallucinogens and Shamanism, edited by Michael Harder, in a chapter called The Mushrooms of Language by anthropologist Henry Munn. He says, language is an ecstatic activity of signification. Intoxicated by the mushrooms, the fluency, the ease, the aptness of expression one becomes capable of are such that one is astounded by the words that issue forth from the contact of the intention of articulation with the matter of experience. The spontaneity the mushrooms liberate is not only perceptual, but linguistic. For the shaman, it is as if existence were uttering itself through him, more likely uttering itself through her, but we won't quibble. So let's return now to the stone ape hypothesis based on the information that we have reviewed. This was received dismissively and vilified when it was first proposed by my brother in the book was published in 1993. Since that book was published, new data has emerged that shifts this from a plausible theory to what you might call more than likely. There are various things pointing to the validity, potentially, of the stone ape hypothesis. Paleoclimatology data indicates that North Africa, where these hominid populations lived as far back as 4 million years ago, was a much wetter and more humid, and 2 million years ago than more recently. The current The environment there is basically very arid. It's a desert. That was not always the case. There are new fossil discoveries that have shown that the ancestors of the modern Cebu cow, Bos primigenius and Bos buensis, evolved in Eurasia and northern Africa from about 5 to 2 million years ago, and their distribution was coincident with the Acheulean culture, a tool-making hominid population of the lower Paleolithic, primarily Homo erectus, that ranged from northern Africa to Eurasia from about 1.75 million years ago to about 110,000 years ago, so fairly recent. These ancestral cattle were undoubtedly important food sources for the hominid populations. The dung of these cattle would provide an ideal substrate for growth of Psilocybe cubensis, the pan-tropical psilocybin mushroom. To this day, this mushroom is frequently found in similar habitats during the rainy season throughout the warm tropics. So it's more than likely that the components of this three-way symbiosis, hominids, cattle, and mushrooms, were present in these savanna habitats 2 million years ago or longer. This is a look at some of this paleoclimatic data. At the top shows that the so-called African humid periods were cyclical and occurred every few hundred years, and they were linked to the precession of the equinoxes. So this shows this chart spans 8 million years on the right to the present on the left. And it shows the cyclical occurrence of the African humid periods related to solar precessional cycles. The region was characterized by alternating periods of humid climates, abundant vegetation, and wide distribution of deep water lakes and shallower alkaline lakes, and drier, more arid periods in which the environment was more savanna-like. So this information, based on this paleoclimatology, shows that northern Africa was at various times over this period quite humid. It was a lake country, effectively. There were many lakes, frequent rainfalls, perfect environment for mushrooms to grow. And the cattle were there and the hominids were there. So all the pieces existed in this environment at that time. And a very simple three-way symbiosis. The cow, which was important to the hominids, hunters, as a source of food and clothing, milk, all sorts of things. And the cows produce dung, and dung is something that mushroom grows on. And that's probably the environment that these hominids found themselves in. Psilocybe cubensis is not a difficult mushroom to spot. It can get quite large, and any foraging hungry hominid is in this environment is surely going to notice these mushrooms, and given that they notice them, they will probably consume them, and then the connection is made. The other world is revealed. So this is a very plausible situation supported by the evidence, albeit, anything based on fossil evidence is always subject to interpretation. But there are some new discoveries from neuroscience and evolutionary biology that provide additional strong evidence to support this theory. One of these is neuroplasticity. The term refers to the ability of the brain to change its organization and synaptic connectivity in response to environmental influences, including drugs. Psilocybin and other psychedelics are known to stimulate neurogenesis and increase neural connectivity. This mechanism can induce changes in neural architecture over short time periods and provides a mechanism for rapid changes in brain development. And this is just a chart depicting that. Neuroplasticity takes place at several levels. At the molecular level, it involves signaling pathways, activation of gene transcription and protein synthesis. All of that is behind the cellular changes that characterize neuroplasticity. Neurogenesis at the neuronal level, the proliferation and differentiation of nerves, the survival of nerves, the migration of nerve complexes, the arborization of nerve networks through the cortex, and the maturation, and then the formation of dendrites, dendritic spines, the morphology of dendritic spines where the serotonin and other neurotransmitters are located, and then also synaptogenesis, the formation of new synaptic junction between these proliferating nerve networks. So this has all been pretty well worked out in the last few years. This was not known or understood when the book was published, but this has all been well studied. And the neuroplasticity that psilocybin and other psychedelics can induce is thought to be very important to its therapeutic effects, to its long-term therapeutic benefits. This leads to what they call greater functional connectivity. There's an increased integration between cortical regions in the psilocybin state. One possible byproduct of this greater communication across the whole brain is the phenomenon of synesthesia, which is often reported in conjunction with the psychedelic state. So there you have the basic mechanism for the complexification of the brain and the complexification of cortical network structures. The second mechanism that we have to invoke is epigenetics, the modulation of gene expression independently of changes to the genome. That is what epigenetics is. These changes can be both heritable and multi-generational. And this is a key mechanism that explains the persistence of neuroplastic adaptations in hominid populations over millennial time spans. Both neuroplasticity and epigenetics were poorly understood by science when Food of the Gods was published. Epigenetics, this is just a little graphic showing what epigenetic is. Epigenetic mechanisms, which can originate from different sources, environmental chemicals, from drugs and pharmaceuticals, from aging and diet. And it involves the processes that might be considered post-transcriptional, and often involves methylation of DNA by an epigenetic factor found in, say, dietary sources. And it can tag the DNA and activate or repress genes. Many genes are wound up in histones, which are effectively knots of DNA. The gene sequences are not available for prescription. But these DNA methylations and these epigenetic factors can effectively unwind these histone tails and render the sequences available to transcription. And then in that way, these newly activated, newly active genetic sequences can become incorporated into the genome, and they transmit multigenerationally. So this provides the second major mechanism whereby these changes in neuroplasticity experienced by individuals in a generation can then propagate over multiple generations. And that's how mushrooms made us conscious. Thank you very much. I want to put a plug in here for the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. It's a nonprofit. We do many different things. We develop programs and symposia, and basically we're focused a lot on symbiosis and psychedelics, and we're a nonprofit, so you're welcome to support us. We're doing many different things. You can look at the website at mckenna.academy, And if you have your phone with you, you could even grab this QR code and go right to it.
They have a mailing list.
So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That I feel like my cortex is expanded. I'm not sure.
Expanded?
I'm not sure my skull can contain it. But thank you for that.
Well,
It's going to give me.
that was the point. Good, good. Did you get all that? It's a lot to cover, and we've just over an hour. So is there time for Q&A, or
Yes.
is
Oh, yes.
everybody
There
so
is.
Yes.
I'm gonna
pumped
stop
that
the
they
share again.
okay?
We
Send-
definitely have time.
so-
If anybody in person has a
Second one.
question, we've got the second mic going around. But if there's anybody on the digital end, hold on one second. We'll make sure the mic gets around here.
This might not be a smart question, but what you said reminded me that I heard through the grapevine somewhere that trauma creates a protein on the DNA that can be seen and detected in DNA. And I'm asking, maybe you know more about this, but what my understanding, my very remedial understanding is that it's been traced back like 8 generations, pretty recently, where if something traumatic happened 8 generations ago, the protein can be actually seen in the DNA and passed on through the generations. So my understanding, my remedial, basic, like zero understanding of psilocybin is that maybe it's a way to alter that genetic predisposition to carrying on the trauma in the DNA. Anyway, I don't know if I made any sense there, but I'm wondering if you know anything about that.
So you're talking about actually, I'm not familiar with it, but you're talking about a protein that's associated with traumatic behavior, or that is a marker for trauma?
Yes,
Is that
sir. So basically, I will dig a little bit and send it to Bruce. My name is Karen Jeske, but yes, this is something I'm very interested in because I'm a, you know, well, I'm a therapist and I also have PTSD, but I understand that. Yeah, so I'll give you more information if I just heard about this. It was up in the Pacific Northwest within the past like 10 years, maybe 5 years, where they found a protein in the DNA that's associated with intergenerational trauma, and that psilocybin could be a way. And based on the picture you just showed, like my mind was blown just looking at it. So I figure, maybe it'll work. I don't know. Picture? Yeah.
well, I mean, what you're talking about, I think, is a classic example of the epigenetic response, right? Uh, Not all epigenetic events are beneficial necessarily. Trauma, environmental toxins. Trauma is one of those things that can induce these long-term changes in gene expression. The body effectively responds to its environment, and it can change it as a process of adaptation to the trauma. It could involve epigenetic gene expression. That would not surprise me at all. In fact, I think there's plenty of literature on that. It just happens that psilocybin is one of these epigenetic triggers or catalysts that is beneficial, but many of them aren't. I mean, they're definitely just because it's epigenetics doesn't mean it's necessarily good, for us as an evolving species. It may be that, in fact, many of the problems that we have and, the problems that humans have that are kind of unique to humans may reflect an accumulation of some of these detrimental epigenetic changes. That's why they're so difficult to address, because you can't really unwind the genome, and actually, I guess you probably can't with the methods that they have now. But yeah, so that's about all I could say about that.
Excellent. If anybody on the Zoom side has a question, you can raise your little digital hands and I'll look out for that. You could also put something in the chat, or if you're here in person, we have the second mic floating around. So feel free. We got a few minutes here. If anybody has a question for Dr. McKenna.
I have a question about the hominids and the cattle. Were they farming the cattle, or was it like wild cows in the field or something that they're hunting, and the relationship could still be symbiotic and all of that? Or were they evolved enough to have
No, no.
farming cattle?
Last the question I can probably answer unambiguously. No, pastoral. These were wild cattle. I mean, they were in the environment. They were in the same environment that the hominids were, and the hominids they were important because they were eating them basically and getting all
Yeah.
sorts of useful things from the cattle. That was just something that the hominids were hunters. They were not. I mean, most likely they were not farming them. These were not pastoralists. They were not deliberately cultivating the cattle. They didn't need to do that. Pastoralism showed up a long time, many millions of years after that, sort of coincidence with the emergence of agriculture, which might have been somewhere between, depends on where you put the marker, but somewhere between 15,000 and 10,000 years ago. Uh, Agriculture showed up in various parts of the world during that time frame. And if there were hominids, or I mean, if there were ungulates, in other words, cattle-like creatures in those environments, the people would have adopted them, would have started to deliberately breed them, or give them an opportunity to breed and use them because they were so important, to their livelihood. And interestingly enough, then, when these pastoral cultures, this would be fairly recent in this process. After there were pastoral civilizations, they were by and large nomadic, and so they spread from Africa through Eurasia, eventually to Europe. And guess what? The mushrooms kind of tagged along with that because they followed the cattle, right? The people migrated, the cattle migrated with them, and the mushrooms just sort of uh, piggybacked along that. The mushrooms traveled into those environments. Mushrooms were on easy street, especially when these communities were actually, herding cattle and breeding cattle. I mean, it was like, for the mushroom, this was a great free ride, plenty of substrate, and with these curious hominids, who for some reason like to eat us, and they spread us all over the place. And you see the situation you have now. I don't know if any of you are familiar with, a lot of you are familiar with Paul Stamets, who is very well known in the mushroom world. He published a book last year called Psilocybin Mushrooms in Their Natural Habitats. And it is a fantastic book. I highly recommend it. And it talks about all of these things. I mean, it is the definitive source book on psilocybin and psilocybin mushrooms. I highly recommend you buy it if you're interested.
Excellent. We do have some questions coming in on the Zoom side, so I'm going to assume this person's name is not Google Pixel 9. If it is, that's a coincidence. But yeah, go right ahead with your question.
My
I've seen,
apologies.
okay.
Yeah, Dr. McKenna, I really appreciate the talk and offering the new scientific pinnings in establishing this stoned age theory. I was wondering if you might offer some of your reflections of kind of the cultural transition that's happened since you've been really kind of thinking about this theory for a long time. And the other part, maybe a little bit more speculation, but humans and our symbiotic relationship with the earth around us, and and developing our full potential through these symbiotic relationships. If you have any thoughts you'd like to share on that.
Well, yeah, you've covered a couple of different things. So the time spans that we're discussing here in this talk are really over millions of years, right? The recent emergence of psilocybin in our society is, well, actually, psilocybin was first synthesized by Albert Hofmann in 1958. So it hasn't been around that long. It's been around a few microseconds compared to these vast time spans at that time. But in that time, psilocybin has gained recognition as something with great potential for healing. And it's about time. It's been around, it's been stewarded by indigenous peoples for thousands of years, as we know, in Mexico and Africa and in Algeria, Egypt. Paul's book goes into this in pretty good detail, but those are relatively recent historical epochs compared to, we're talking mostly about the prehistoric epoch, so it's easy to speculate. I think that it's just a continuing process of coevolution. People talk, people think that evolution is driven by natural selection, competition, nature red in tooth and claw, the dominant species emerges, and that's not really what drives evolution. What drives evolution, more importantly, is symbiosis and the formation of mutually beneficial alliances between unrelated organisms. And symbiosis is all over in nature. Everywhere you look, you get symbiosis. And look at, for example, the relationship between bees and flowers. Flowers require bees to pollinate, and as a result, then they're able to reproduce. And flowers then provide the nectar to the bee and other forms of food. So that's classic symbiosis. Well, it exists in the human realm too. We form alliances with food plants. We cultivate the plants and we consume the plants. That benefits us. And the plants get a free ride. They don't have to make it in the wild anymore. We kind of take them under our wing and domesticate them, and they get an easy evolutionary ride because we're looking after them. And symbiosis, I have a whole lecture on symbiosis. I'm more and more talking about that. But symbiosis is what drives evolution, and not so much competition. Natural selection plays a role. That's not the definitive factor that is pushing evolution forward toward greater complexity. It's symbiosis. And, so I guess that's enough to say about that.
Oh, I
I do.
appreciate that larger perspective. Yeah.
All right, we do have another person's hand up, and there are some questions in the chat we'll try to get to too. But Seth, you're next up. You have your hand up.
Okay.
Yeah. Hey, thanks, Dr. McKenna, for sharing your valuable time. I think back graduating high school in 1995, what my life trajectory would have been had I gotten my hands on Food of the Gods back then. I've learned a lot. So, but here's my question. You talked about the trifecta of the cattle, the humanoid, and the mushroom, and a lot of that hypothesis comes from the mindset of a North African start. But as you have traveled in South America and up the Mexico Peninsula, the same psilocybin mushroom exists there. And I'm kind of curious your thoughts of how that hypothesis may apply on the other continents, where life is clearly has a long history, even from the statues in your background. That there's obviously a big history of the use of mushrooms and of how the mushrooms impacted that culture. And so I'm kind of curious of what your thoughts are on the South American and the Americas of how this mushroom and the hypothesis applied on that side of the continent in parallel with what was going on in Africa and Eurasia.
Well, yeah, again, I have to recommend Paul's book because he has a very interesting chapter about all of this. Because psilocybin is not that rare in these guild mushrooms. There's 200 species, about 230 more species are being discovered all the time, and they're globally distributed. So every ecosystem has a psilocybin buried species, and people are very clever, and they discover these things. People are, primitive people, let's call them indigenous people, were very good at finding things in their environment that could benefit them, and they were very good at finding mushrooms. So the anthropologists have focused on Mexico primarily as kind of the epicenter of magic mushrooms. There's less evidence in South America, but there is some beginning to emerge. But then in other cultures, like with the Sasali culture in Algeria, and then it turns out in Egypt and India, there are some very interesting iconographies that are suggestive of mushrooms, that are so suggestive of mushrooms, in fact, that they really couldn't be anything else. And in Europe, you have the Liberty caps, the little Psilocybe semilanciata, which grow in pastures. You could find them in almost any. That was probably the European psilocybin mushroom that people are acute observers. They notice things, and particularly indigenous people that live closely in these environments, they notice these things. They're curious, and they say, oh, well, here's a succulent morsel, looks pretty good. Let's try it. And they try it, and the connection is made. Maybe they wanted a gustatory experience, and instead they get a psychedelic experience, but that'll do. There is one resource I want to mention too that Paul talks about in his book, and anyone can. It's called iNaturalist.org, I think it is. The letter I, Naturalist. This is a place that has location data basically for any plant that people put into the database. And when you come to, and there are lots of reports of locations of mushrooms. There's a wonderful map in Paul's book that shows where these mushrooms have been identified so far. But it works for any plant. I highly recommend that you go to iNaturalist. Some places it's .org, other places it's .com, other places it's .ca, but it's the same website, iNaturalist something, and go to that website and look around. Put some names in. Doesn't have to be psilocybin. Put some names. Put in cannabis. See where that shows up. Put in any plant you're interested in. It'll either be there or not, because these are reports based on people that have actually posted a report onto iNaturalist, and you can join it. You can be part of that community.
Thank you, Dr. McKenna. Appreciate your time again, sir.
Did that answer your question? Okay, great.
And
check out
we only
iNaturalist. It's a great site. It's amazing.
We only have just a couple minutes left. We do want to be cognizant of your time, Dr. McKenna. There just were a couple of just short questions in the chat. I want to make sure we try to hit those. The first one, do you think that
Sure.
psilocybin can help treat things like mental illness, substance use, other things of that nature? That's the first one.
Well, I think it's clear, yes, that it can. I mean, there's plenty of scientific data to support this now. Psilocybin has been looked at for the usual spectrum, trauma, PTSD, addictions, intractable, excuse me, I'm losing my voice, uh, treatment-resistant depression, all of these things, and there's just an abundance of scientific and clinical data to show that it can be used to treat many kinds of mental illnesses, if you want to call that, or mental disorders. It's one of the superstars in this area because it's completely non-toxic. It is not a threat to human health at all in that respect. It's a profound psychedelic, but it's not that dangerous. Obviously, all the usual tropes about the importance of set and setting apply. You should take these things if you're going to take them. Do it thoughtfully. Do it in a setting that you have carefully considered where and when you're going to use it. But there's no doubt it can be used to treat these illnesses, and the FDA and the regulatory bodies that govern this sort of thing, they're always slow to move on it. But I think eventually you'll be able to get psilocybin therapy everywhere, and now certain states have legalized it. So I believe in Oregon and Colorado you can get psilocybin. There are actually clinics you could go to that offer psilocybin. I'm proud to say I think that Minnesota is about to do this. So this is probably how it's going to happen. It's going to happen on the state level. Of so
We're right up against our out time, I know, but there was another question in the chat. I just want to make sure we get to this one too that says, how do you see consciousness evolving? Is human evolution about increasing cognitive complexity or something different? So, consciousness question, how do you see that evolving in some of your work?
boy, I think that's a difficult question to answer. I certainly don't know. It would be nice if we knew what consciousness is, for one thing. There's a lot of interest in that, just defining what it is. Anyone who has read Michael Pollan's new book, I think it's called A World Appears. People know his book about psychedelics. This one is more recent, but it's a book that tackles the issue of what is consciousness, and it's brilliant. It's much better, in my opinion, than his book on psychedelics, which is still good, but people should read that book if you're curious
Thank,
about consciousness. Yeah.
thank you for that, Dr. McKenna. I think with that, we'll wind it up. We appreciate you taking time to expand our consciousness, and this will be archived on YouTube, and as a way to get the word out to the community, educating them in the right way. So we thank you very much for your time, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you for the invitation, and I look forward to that. Yeah. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. I had a wonderful time.
Yeah.
I'll talk
So
to
thank
you.
you again.
We'll be in touch. Okay. Very good. Very good.
And thanks everybody
Bye.
for coming.